The air in this room is so thick you could almost bite it. It's a choking stew of incense, myrrh, warm oil, and something harder to name. It doesn't really smell like anything, but it presses on your chest all the same. Fear. The only light comes from the last dying slice of sunset, strained through layers of silk curtains. Everything glows in a sick amber haze, like the whole chamber is submerged in old honey. This isn't the shining public splendor of Susa or Persepolis. This is deeper, hidden, private. We're inside the king's own fortified inner world, past the ceremonial halls, past the guards, past the places even nobles rarely see. Servants move quickly around a girl on a low couch. Their hands glide over her skin, rubbing in perfumed oil with careful, practiced motions. But their fingers tremble, not from cold, from dread. The girl they're preparing is barely more than a child. Her collarbones look sharp under the thin veil draped across her shoulders, as if her body is still deciding whether it belongs to childhood or womanhood. She doesn't know if she's number 100 or number 1,000 in this place. In a maze like this, numbers stop mattering fast. She knows only one thing, one truth so cold it feels like ice running through her veins. The man waiting in the next room isn't just the King of Kings, not only ruler of millions from India to Greece, not only the earthly face of Ahura Mazda's order, he is her father. From the outside, the Persian Empire looks like the marvel of the world, an unstoppable machine of conquest, wealth, and precision. Xerxes I sits at its peak, the heir of Darius the Great. He commands armies like storms. His treasury is beyond imagination. He can decide life or death with a breath. But when power becomes absolute, it doesn't just rule land, it eats the soul. It demands bigger and bigger violations just to feel real. And behind gilded walls, inside chambers guarded by eunuchs where no human law can reach, absolute power had rotted into absolute depravity. This isn't a story about heroic battles or famous victories. This is a story about a prison dressed in silk and a crime buried inside its own family tree. A secret Greek historians only dared to whisper, too frightened to write openly. To understand Xerxes' fall, we have to understand the machine that shaped him. Because the Persian royal harem wasn't just a pleasure house. It was politics. It was an institution. It was a state inside the state running on its own hidden rules. When Xerxes inherited the throne from Darius, he didn't just inherit territory. He inherited this system of control. The harem was a weapon, a carefully designed fortress inside the palace. No one entered without permission. No one left at all. Imagine endless corridors lined with cedar doors so thick they swallow sound. Inner gardens where sunlight slips in but never quite seems to escape. Air heavy with perfumes and quiet footsteps. The outside world feels like a rumor here. Inside lived hundreds of women, living proof of Persian conquest. Princesses from defeated kingdoms sent as guarantees of peace. Daughters of Persian nobles offered as tribute to secure family loyalty. Musicians and dancers from distant provinces. Concubines gathered from every corner of the empire. A human mosaic of imperial power. Each woman had a place in a rigid hierarchy, and every one of them was property of the state. Not a metaphor, literally state-owned. Their bodies, their futures, their children, all belonged to the king because the king was the empire. So who ran this luxurious prison? The eunuchs, men stripped of the ability to father children, and with it stripped of loyalty to any bloodline but the king's. They were administrators, gatekeepers, accountants, spies, and sometimes executioners. They decided who ate, who wore jewels, who slept near fountains, who was locked in shadow. They controlled who saw the king, and more importantly, what information moved through these walls. Every woman brought into the harem went through careful preparation. She was trained in music, dance, refined conversation, and erotic arts. A few could gain influence through intimacy. Some rose to the rank of chief wife or favorite consort. But it was a ruthless game. Competition was savage. A well-timed whisper could lift a woman into power. A wrong glance could mean death before sunrise. This was a world of painted smiles hiding silent conspiracies, where daggers lived inside silk sleeves. A perfect prison, a golden cage. The captives wore the finest cloth, tasted the richest foods, lived among fountains and flowers, and lost their freedom forever. And inside that cage, a new tragedy began to grow, one the architects of the system hadn't fully predicted. Children were being born within these walls. When a concubine became pregnant and gave birth to a girl, that child's fate was sealed with her first cry. These daughters, Xerxes' biological children, grew up in the same maze that held their mothers. They were princesses, but without status. Unlike daughters born to official queens, they weren't groomed for political marriage or alliances. They weren't sent to secure treaties. They weren't displayed as symbols of dynastic prestige. They lived in a terrifying gray zone, royal blood in their veins, but treated like part of the harem's collection. From infancy, the harem was their entire universe. They watched their mothers and hundreds of other women live in endless waiting, waiting for the king's call, waiting for favor, waiting for survival. They breathed rivalry, jealousy, obedience like oxygen. They learned how to walk down corridors without making sound, how to lower their eyes at the right moment, how to smile without meaning it. But above all, they learned absolute submission. They were taught, from the time they could understand language, that their bodies were not their own. Their bodies belonged to the empire, and the empire was the king. While these girls were growing inside that sealed world, the man who had fathered them was changing. After Xerxes' catastrophic defeats against the Greeks, especially Salamis, something in him curdled. The outer world had humiliated him. The conquest he believed was his destiny had failed. So he retreated inward, determined to rule like a god over the one place he could control completely: the harem. This is where unlimited power turns poisonous. When you can have anything instantly, pleasure goes dull. When the most beautiful women in the empire are always waiting to submit, beauty becomes ordinary. Submission stops tasting like anything at all. So absolute power doesn't seek satisfaction anymore. It seeks transgression. It needs sharper shocks, darker borders, stronger taboos to break, just to feel alive, just to prove its power is still absolute. Greek historians like Herodotus recorded the early warning signs. They wrote that Xerxes became obsessed with the wife of his brother, Mecistes. When she rejected him, he turned to her daughter, his own niece, and forced her into a relationship. A pattern was forming. Bloodlines were blurring in the mind of a man who believed himself divine. To Xerxes, people weren't people. They were extensions of his will. He ruled nations. He owned women. And in the most terrifying way, he owned the children those women produced. As the daughters born in the harem reached puberty, their frozen status became a sentence. They weren't married off. They weren't allowed to leave. They were held close for a purpose no one dared to say out loud. And everyone knew. The eunuchs knew. The servants knew. The mothers knew. Horror lived in the silence between them, because silence was the only way to stay alive here. Anyone who spoke, anyone who even hinted, simply disappeared. The machine of control worked perfectly. It existed to protect the king's secrets at any cost. Transgression wasn't just an idea now. It was becoming a practice. The Greek physician-historian Ctesias, who served inside the Persian court and claimed access to royal records, left behind fragments that hint at how far this corruption went. His work survives only in pieces, but what remains paints a palace soaked in moral collapse, where the darkest taboos weren't rare exceptions. They were routine. For the young princesses, coercion wasn't a threat hanging in the future. It was the air they'd lived in their whole lives. How could a girl refuse a man who was, at the same time, her father, her king, and the living shadow of God on earth? She had been born inside the cage, raised for the jailer's pleasure. The system didn't just allow that reality, it actively prepared for it. When the king wanted one of these girls, the eunuchs handled it like logistics. No morality, no hesitation. They selected her from the records. They sent servants to bathe her. They combed her hair, painted her eyes, dressed her in veils soft enough to make obedience feel like luxury. Then they delivered her as calmly as they would carry a tray of wine. Even the architecture helped the secret breathe. Isolated chambers linked by hidden passageways meant what happened in the king's private rooms stayed invisible to the rest of the palace. Walls swallowed sound. Corridors forked into shadow. The whole place was built to make horror quiet. Xerxes, sealed inside his own power and humiliation, no longer saw people. He saw possessions. His daughters were not family in his mind. They were the rarest, most exclusive products of his collection. Taking them was the ultimate proof that his dominance stretched even over creation itself. He made life and then consumed it. Inside the harem, the atmosphere grew heavier, more suspicious. Mothers tried to keep their daughters out of sight, tried to disguise their maturity, tried to delay what they knew was coming. But it was useless. The eunuchs kept precise lists: names, ages, lineage, physical descriptions. The moment a girl crossed the threshold into puberty, her file changed. A quiet mark beside her name, a new category. And when the king sent for her, there was no appeal, no bargaining, no hiding place deep enough. This was the same man who, in legend, had ordered the sea chained at the Hellespont because he believed nature itself had disobeyed him. The same irrational tyranny now turned inward onto his own blood. Outside the palace, cracks had started to form in the empire. But inside, his private empire had become a nightmare kingdom. And even in the ancient world, where moral standards could be brutal and very different from ours, there was one line almost nobody crossed. Incest between father and daughter was the universal taboo. Yes, Egyptian pharaohs married sisters. Yes, Persia had a custom called shwedadah, consanguineous marriage, that could permit unions between cousins or even half-siblings to keep bloodlines pure. But father and daughter was the final frontier, the last wall. Even the most ruthless tyrants usually stopped there. For Xerxes, that was exactly why it tempted him. Breaking the supreme taboo was the supreme affirmation of power. It declared he was above human law, above nature, above even divine order. It was the only forbidden thing left to a man who already owned everything else. So we return to the chamber. Perfume suffocates the air. Oil gleams on skin. Silk shifts like water. The girl, his daughter, steps inside, guided by silent hands. The eunuchs close the door behind her and wait outside. Faces like stone masks. They hear everything. They process nothing. Living locks, breathing walls. If we try to understand her psychology, one thing becomes clear. The idea of consent doesn't even exist here. How could anyone reject a man who holds literal power of life and death over her? A man who is also her father, also her king, also the earthly representative of everything sacred. Her world has been engineered from birth to deliver her to this moment. Submission in the harem wasn't personal, it was industrial. Not a choice, a programmed function. And for Xerxes, this wasn't simple lust. It was something colder, something self-devouring, a closed loop of domination where he was both the creator of life and the consumer of it. He wasn't reaching for pleasure anymore. He was reaching for proof. Proof that no boundary could resist him. Greek sources, hostile to Persia and eager to paint Xerxes as decadent, recorded only fragments of this truth. They gathered whispers from deserters, spies, disgraced nobles, people who fled the court carrying scars they wouldn't show in daylight. But those whispers were consistent. In his final years, Xerxes stopped making distinctions. Humiliated by Greece and poisoned by limitless power, his mind collapsed into a black hole of depravity. While the outer empire slowly unraveled, the king obsessed over consolidating his inner empire of corruption. He neglected the machinery of state. Provincial governors, the satraps, began abusing their authority without fear. Local unrest flared. The army lost morale. The Persian colossus, once unstoppable, started to wobble. The harem, once a symbol of imperial glory, had become the tomb of his sanity. And inside that tomb, countless young lives were crushed in ritual silence. The daughter's history would never name. Girls broken by their own father, turned into ghosts inside their own home. Silent witnesses to the moral collapse of the most powerful man on earth. A system built on fear and secrecy always turns on itself eventually. Collapse isn't a maybe, it's a deadline. By 465 BCE, the patience of Persia's elite had burned out. Xerxes didn't die on a battlefield. He died at the heart of the palace, inside his own bedroom, under the roof he believed was unbreakable. The chief conspirator was Artabanus, captain of the royal guard, the man closest to the king, guardian of his life, and possibly the man who knew too much about what happened behind those sealed doors. Artabanus worked with Aspamitres, a high-ranking eunuch, one of the very administrators of the depravity Xerxes had cultivated. One night, they moved through those silent corridors with the confidence of men who understood the palace better than the king ever did. Artabanus entered the king's chambers. The death was fast, brutal, not a ritual, not a warning, just a blade in the dark, cutting down a man who believed himself divine. The King of Kings, who had violated every natural law he could reach, fell under the hand of his own servant. And in that instant, the forced silence of the harem cracked. Screams tore through the hallways. Metal clanged, blood-stained carpets that cost more than villages. Guards and eunuchs fought, panicked, scrambling to seize control of a palace suddenly without its god. In the chaos, Xerxes' son moved quickly. Artaxerxes, young, sharp, ruthless, understood that power doesn't wait for grief. He blamed the assassination on his older brother, Darius, and before anyone could question that story, he executed Darius immediately. Power replaced power. That was all. Inside the harem, hundreds of women waited for freedom that never came. When the god fell, their sacrifices weren't honored. They were inherited. They weren't released. They were transferred like valuables in a will, from one dead king to the next living one. And for the daughters who had been destroyed, there was no justice, no rescue, no healing. The death of their abuser wasn't an ending. It was only the start of another cycle under another master. The machine of the harem remained intact, the doors still locked, the corridors still swallowed sound, the eunuchs still kept the lists. So what did Xerxes leave behind? Not a stronger empire, a humiliated one, shaken by Greece, already past its zenith, sliding into irreversible decline. Persepolis and Susa still glittered with gold and carved stone, but now they felt like a hollow shell, like rot hidden under gold leaf. Yet his most terrifying legacy wasn't the palace, or the wars, or even the assassination. It was the curse of absolute power. Because the real sickness of the harem wasn't just one man's corruption, it was the system itself. The harem was engineered to strip humanity from an entire class of people, women, and inflate one man's authority until it seemed divine. In a system like that, tragedy isn't an accident, it's a guarantee. Absolute power is a hereditary disease. It passes from king to king, corroding each generation in its own way. Xerxes didn't invent the cage, but he proved how far the cage could go once a damaged man sat at its center. History, of course, is written by winners and survivors. It records the names of Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and Alexander the Great, the conqueror who would one day burn Persepolis to ash. But history does not record the name of a single one of Xerxes' daughters born in the harem. Not one. They remain anonymous forever. Ghosts in the margins. Silent statistics of what power truly costs. Their existence survives only as grotesque whispers in enemy texts, filtered through hatred and fear. And that alone tells you something important. The most horrifying crimes in human history don't always happen on battlefields. They often happen in sealed rooms, guarded by silence, made possible by the quiet cooperation of an entire system. Xerxes' story isn't just a dark footnote from ancient Persia, dead and buried 2.5 millennia ago. It's a warning that doesn't age. Persepolis' stone walls have fallen. The empire is dust, but invisible harems are built again and again in every era. They rise wherever power concentrates without restraint, wherever secrecy replaces transparency, wherever a group of people is stripped of humanity and treated like property. Official history is the version rulers allow the world to see. We know what they wanted us to know. What we don't know, the truth of victims, the secrets of locked chambers, almost always stays buried. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What do you think is the darkest truth about ancient dynasties that official history tried to hide? What other crimes have been swallowed beneath golden palace floors? Tell me in the comments what hidden stories you want us to dig into next. Because history was not written by its victims, but it is our responsibility to go looking for their voices. And if you know someone who loves the untold, shadowed side of the past, share this video with them. The powerful have always wanted their darkest corners kept secret. Let's keep shining light into them.